Chablis is the name of a town and an appellation that lies in the valley of the River Serein, in the northernmost part of Burgundy, 110 kilometers northwest of Dijon. It has a slightly cooler climate than the Côte d'Or. It is well known for wines made with Chardonnay varieties. In this episode, we speak to Rosemary George, Master of Wine, author of the book The Wines of Chablis. Chablis has experienced a major swing in its popularity. In the early 19th century, it enjoyed a boom due to its relative proximity to Paris. Plantings in Chablis shrank under the powdery mildew, and above all, the building of the Paris-Lyons-Marseille railway in the middle of the 19th century. As Rosemary says, Chablis region is not going through a renaissance, but an evolution. The population after the First World War and the devastating frost of 1945 reduced Chablis to a low point of just 500 hectares. In more recent decades, demand has led to the land and the vine growing back to 5,500 hectares. Chablis is a fascinating region that hides many unique challenges, which are going to be explored in this episode. Remember to follow the podcast to know when the new episodes are going to be released. Hi, I'm Mattia Scarpazza, and this is the Looking Into Wine podcast. Wine and winemaking can be complex, but this podcast has a simple mission. We want to give you the skills and tools to harness your passion about wine. Through this series, we will shine a spotlight on some of the different regions, process, and concepts that shape the fascinating world of wine. I hope you enjoy the show and your own journey looking into wine. Welcome to the Looking Into Wine podcast. I'm Mattia Scarpazza. Today's guest was one of the first ever female Master of Wine, gaining a Master of Wine status in 1979. She has worked as freelance wine journalist since 1981. She was the vice president of the Circle of Wine Writers, becoming its president in April 2015. She has written 14 books, including 3 on Chablis, and she contributes to various magazines, such as Decanter. I'm very proud to welcome to the show Rosemary George. Welcome.
Thank you, Matthew.
So 14 books, including 3 on Chablis.
That's right. Yeah.
Your first book, one of your first books was on Chablis, or if not the...
Yes, the very first was Chablis, yes. I never set out to be a wine writer, but the opportunity for a book happened, so I grabbed it.
Yeah, it sounds great. And why was Chablis? Why did you sort of...
Well, it was chapter of accidents. I'd actually just been sacked for the wine trade. I was working for a small wine merchant who decided he was, I was not what he needed for his company. I'll be discreet and not name names. And I'd met an Englishman who was the export director of Domaine La Roche, it's also a Negociant company. And he said, come and see me in Chablis sometime. And I was already going to France to sort of see some friends. And I thought, well, I'll just go on to Chablis. And I got a commission to write a piece for Martin filled me in on lots of background. These are the questions to ask, this and that. And then I went to see, it was Domaine d'Europe, and had a very good tasting with the cellar master, who said, well, you realise 100 years ago, there were 40,000 hectares of vines in the Yonne, Chablis and surroundings. Well, I have a history degree, so I thought, well, what happened? And that in 1981, there were just 3,000 hectares. So the historian in me wondered what had happened to the other 37,000, and that's quite an interesting story. And I sort of just thought, there's a book to be written. Came back to London.
Yeah, and then you're still doing your publishing.
It still excites me. When people ask you that question, what's your favourite wine? I tend to quip, well, it's the wine in my glass at the moment, I hope. But if I have to really sort of think seriously, if I had to, if I was condemned to just drink one wine for the rest of my life, it would be Chablis in its various forms. It's a couple of years ago now. I actually can't remember. I've got it on my desk. I'll tell you when it was published. I've had a bit of a blitz of writing books for Infinite Ideas, the publishers. So it's 2019.
I forget it was 2022 already.
So the first one came out in 1984. Yeah. Then I did sort of Chablis 25 years on, and then Chablis another 10 years later.
So what did change in all these years? What did you see then in the people have changed? What?
Yes, but people have changed. I mean, in the first, I'm writing about in the second book the children of the people in the first book, and in the third book, it's the grandchildren of the people in the first book, and in some instances, the great grandchildren, which did give you a bit of a shock. Uh, so yes, I mean, you've got the generation changes, and there is very much, there are a lot of long-standing families in Chablis. You think like Duvistin, Ravenel, and and several others. Um, I mean, I think looking at it wine terms, winemaking wise, viticulture wise, like everywhere, it's become more professional. Say not sophisticated, but you know, there were some pretty rustic cellars in Chablis in 1981, and those rustic cellars have they are now a thing of the past. I mean, the whole the way that white winemaking has become much more hygienic than it was, and I think there's a better understanding of the vineyards. There's also more organic viticulture, which 40 years ago people have said organic, no, impossible. It's the climate's too wet, and I mean it's still quite difficult, but there are that's also sustainability and all those sort of things. Or you've got haute valeur environnementale, which is another standard of vineyard work, and so. Yes. Well, I think this thing about Chablis, it's lumped with Burgundy. In books, it's always been the last or the first chapter in a book on Burgundy. But Chablis is very separate from the rest of Burgundy. It's 100 kilometers from the Côte d'Or, and you've got the hills of the Morvan between. So Chablis, it has been called l'Île Vineuse, the wine island, or it's been called the Porte d'Or, to the Golden Gate to Burgundy. So it is very much its own place. To me, it's. And absolutely, it's closer to Champagne. I mean, Champagne is just up the road, and once upon a time, grapes, grown in Chablis, did find themselves to Champagne until the laws of provenance became stricter.
So you were saying earlier that we risked almost to lose, not lose Chablis, but the numbers have struck me like
Oh
40.
yes, in the mid-50s.
Yeah,
I mean, Chablis was.
what happened?
I mean, one of the things I did was talk to some of the elderly wine growers who remember the mid-50s. I can remember one lovely guy called Alain Poutre saying, life was miserable because they couldn't earn a living. And in fact, I mean, a lot of people farm. They didn't just grow, make wine. They also had, animals and all that. But the area of Chablis shrunk to just a little over 500 hectares. Today it's well over 5,000 hectares. And people reminisced, they had, I think in the 50s, there were 3 vintages of very severe frost. And that meant, tiny, tiny yields. People remember skiing down the slopes of Les Clos in the very hard winter of 1956, because that shows how little the vineyards were planted, that you could actually ski. A lot of land was not actually planted. And the 50s saw the first attempts to protect the vines from frost, lighting fires and things.
Okay, and so basically there was so barren that even like the Grand Cru planting now the Grand Cru they weren't completely.
Yes, I mean now the Grand Cru are absolutely fully planted. It's a slope of 100 hectares that is fully planted, and the delimited area, is gradually being filled in.
Yeah, I mean that's.
There's a tiny growth each year, but it's very tiny. I mean, the big growth was in the early 80s when they also recognised some newer Premier Cru, and people have said, well, those Premier Cru, they were vineyards that were planted before phylloxera, because that was when Chablis was at its height for scale of planting. It was before the phylloxera crisis happened, and so they were reviving vineyards that had produced good wine in the 1880s.
Okay, so basically they did I mean, timeline wise they did the Grand Cru classification, then they added the Premier Cru.
I mean, I think it all vaguely happened at once. They had to, because Chablis, is it 1938 is the appellation, and it was Petit Chablis, Chablis, the Premier Cru, and the Grand Cru. So that's okay. That was recognised, and then then there was the extension. With people for and people against. So there was William Fair wrote a diatribe about le vrai Chablis. It wasn't just, I mean, Petit Chablis was always part of Chablis. You know, there was a recognition that the outlying vineyards weren't as good as the vineyards actually round the small town of Chablis itself, because it's Chablis. The appellation is Chablis and 19 villages, and so and a lot of the growth was, you know, in the vineyards of village Chablis and in the Premier Cru. And probably it's the Premier Cru that was probably the most discussion about. But actually, you know, but that's all settled down. You know, I think it was a recognition that actually, you know, it's quite a small, compact vineyard area, but it has a worldwide reputation. So you need it needs, you know, it needs some crop to sustain its reputation. Yes, yes. And also the way the name was borrowed in the New World. I mean, there was a time when you could go to California and buy, you know, Californian Chablis that was made from Thompson seedless. And my friend in Chablis, he rewrote a drawing of these two rugged guys. It's a Domier print of it, but they're sitting in a tavern in the Napa Valley, and one's saying to the other, "Do you know what I've just heard? Chablis wine, they make it in France too."
Yeah, there's a
But that's all. That has long since gone. But certainly Chablis at one stage did mean, you know, like white wine or white Burgundy. It wasn't just Chablis. And of course, because the name is so pronounceable, it's so easy.
yeah, exactly. That's definitely one of the positives of it. And how this, what do you seen in the last 10 years? What is the latest vintages that you are looking out, and what is the
I like the vintages which have got no firm acidity. So 2014, 17. I
hmm
think of both those are two that stand out for me as being that kind of, you know, razor sharp, really flinty, really good acidity. I think that's my idea of Chablis. I mean, that's the one thing I love Chablis, is that the wines are so much sort of focused, more razor sharp than the wines of the Côte d'Or.
And then, do you see? Have you seen any of like, obviously, like with this climate change and the climate is warming? Have you seen that the sort of lightness of Chablis is a risk a little bit, or they're doing
I
it?
suppose, I mean, I think it's a consideration. I mean, one of the things that's very noticeable is that the harvest is so much earlier. I mean, the classic Chablis harvest in the 1970s was the 1st of October. You know, in this decade, well, in the last decade, there have been, you know, vintages that have started at the end of August.
Okay, wow.
So, you know, so there's a month's difference. And now probably the harvest tends to start, if it's a sort of average year, it will start in early September.
Okay.
So that has definitely been a shift.
But obviously, I mean, obviously, one of the things is happening, and is like the winter frost has seems to be becoming very.
Yes, I mean frost is still is an issue, and of course there is a lot of, you know, effort spent in trying to combat frost. You know, and combating frost is quite complicated because
hmm
you can spray the vines, but then you're going to get a sea of mud afterwards
Yeah.
when everything's melted. You can use heaters, but that's, you know, that's not very
Mm.
ecologically sound, and is also quite tricky
Yeah.
and expensive. And, you know, there was a limit to what people could afford to do. Then I did encounter the local electrician in Chablis, and he's got a system of, you know, you can put electric wires at sort of a little bit above the ground, which will sort of
Okay.
keep things warm. And, you know, there are sort of various, you know, there are more things happening to try and you know, to protect the vines against frost. You know,
Has it been more severe lately? Have you found it and has been more like?
trying to think the last. Yes, there've been one or two, because I think there'd been a bit of a lull, and then I think was it 17 that had a sort of unexpected, and then there's another, was it 19? There's been or 20. I must get my vintages a bit muddled up, but there was one when they actually the temperatures dropped too low for them to be able to do anything about it, and for too many nights they were sort of running out of fuel and, you know, running out of you know, energy to combat the frost. Because also the trouble is, if you're going to light the heaters, you're up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and if you've got to do that, or, you know, for several nights in a row, it's pretty shattering.
Yeah. Oh wow. That's. I mean, obviously, frosting brings a lot of risk. We can be a risk of buds and being killed, and the plant itself dying, and so yeah.
I mean, it'd be rare for spring frost to kill a vine, but it's, you know, it's the buds, and of course it also impacts on the next year's growth.
So have you
Is
seen?
the
Have
other
you seen
factor.
like what are the last vintages? Are they a bit smaller compared to usual? Are they? Is,
Well, I know the last time I was actually in Chablis was June 2018, and of course the summer it's hail time of year, and they'd had 3 short vintages. And I remember being aware of anybody I was talking to, they suddenly saw a large cloud coming towards them. Please don't hail on me, stay away. In fact, 2018 they had actually, I think, the largest vintage they've ever had, and then 1920. Just trying to think. Because 2021 is a very small vintage. It's a small vintage. 20 is not so bad, I think. I'm not, but because I haven't been there, I'm sort of less.
But before, when you were saying about the seed of mud, it made me think obviously of the soil of Chablis, which is like this clay, and
Yeah, but it's limestone and clay, and don't forget the little oyster shells, because it was part of the Parisian basin. And Kimmeridge takes its name from the Dorsetshire village of Kimmeridge on the other side of the channel.
okay, well that I didn't know. So,
Yes, and Portland Bill. That's also another Dorset landmark.
okay, well that's the influence of the English over again.
Yeah.
So how important it is this Kimmeridge and clay? What does he do for the growing condition?
Well, I think they use Kimmeridgian soil to delimit the best vineyards. Though I actually had a very interesting conversation with a very nice woman, Lucy. I can never say her name properly because it's a slightly Dutch name. Anyway, Lucy, she actually did her university thesis on the soil of Chablis, and she would argue that actually Portlandian is almost as good, but Kimmeridgian assumed importance because it was used for delimiting the vineyards, and the Grand Cru, and the best Premier Cru are very much Kimmeridgian.
Okay.
And she'd also say that subsoil also matters, and as do things like aspect, and there are other things that come into play.
And all the Grand Cru area is all planted on Kimmeridgian clay.
That's all planted. That's that one slope. But the Grand Cru area is actually there's lots of there's even a little bit of, I think it's Valmure that faces north, because it's there are little inlets. It's not a flat slope by any means. And if you're in Chablis, you can go up. There's a lovely viewpoint at the top above the Grand Cru where you get a very good view of looking down the Grand Cru and then the town and then the Premier Cru across the other side of the valley.
Okay, and can you sort of see in tasting? Could you divide the 2 valley sides? Would there be any difference?
Well, I think you certainly would say that the Grand Cru, if you have more weight than the Premier Cru. And so the Premier Cru that are on the Grand Cru side of the valley are the ones also that have more weight. So Mont-de-Milieu, Monte de Tonnerre, and then you've got Fauchaume on the other side of the Grand Cru, which is as large as or larger than the Grand Cru, because Fauchaume is about 100 hectares. But I think you'd sort of say, yes, the most sort of the Premier Cru that is most like the Grand Cru is certainly Monte de Tonnerre.
Okay, so there's the side of so that would be the eastern side where you have.
So the ones that are is the right bank.
The right bank,
so the facing west. They're warmer.
Okay, we call it the right or the left.
And also, I mean, so the Grand Cru tend to have more weight because they're the wines that are likely to be vinified with oak. But I think, to me, one of the charms of Chablis, it is it's the one serious Chardonnay that doesn't need oak. And of course, it also has this kind of chameleon effect that if you let it age, it can take on the sort of little notes that make you think it's been in oak when it hasn't. I've certainly had that on more than one occasion, several occasions. You suddenly said, there's a little sort of nutty somethingness. And that the wine grower has not used the stave of oak. That's one of the ways, it's one of the ways it ages.
For me, Chablis has always been my sort of Achilles heel in blind tasting. I can't think of a time where I ever got, this is Chablis. And it's always been my trick here. But how would you identify a Chablis compared to any other Chardonnay out there? Well,
I think it's the acidity. There is a kind of freshness, a more razor sharp. I don't want to say acidity, but it's a good acidity. It should never be green, but it does have that kind of focused, very sort of pure acidity. Whereas I think other Chardonnay, the Côte d'Or and the New World Chardonnay, tend to be much riper, richer. They're richer wines, sort of soft acidity, or there's more of an oak influence. To me, there's kind of Chablis got a sort of a refreshingness to it.
Yeah, that definitely that you can get it, and I mean, it never gets almost like too overripe as well. I always find that.
No, there's a flintiness, and then there's that overused word minerality that And there's also because the Parisian Basin was a lake. I mean, was a sea. There are the oyster effect. There is a sort of what I call an iodine effect. You can sometimes get a slightly salty note to it as well. But it's flintiness, I think, is the key characteristic of Chablis that is maturing.
Yeah, and
it is worth maturing, keeping bottles a little bit, because I think Chablis, when it's young, it's sort of light and fresh and very appealing. Then it does an adolescent sulk and grunts at you for a couple of years, and then it comes out again as a fully grown up wine.
Yeah, and it brings its famous Chablis, especially the Grand Cru, to have this smokiness, and that come through.
Yes, it's sort of smoky, flinty. The smokiness can sometimes kind of come from oak, but it should be it's kind of flinty, stony, those sort of flavors.
Okay. And what?
Gosh, this made me feel thirsty. You've got a glass of wine.
So,
well, I've got a glass of water.
Well, what are you seeing in winemaking techniques? What has changed? Has been any sort of trends, or is it
nothing? There's nothing dramatic. I think when I said there's been an evolution rather than a revolution. I think one of the things actually that the wine growers in Chablis, the new generation, has travelled abroad. They haven't just learnt from their parents. They've actually, they've travelled. You meet wine growers who've spent time in New Zealand or California or that. So there's some, the Chablis is much more open to the outside world than it was, and I think that certainly has an effect. And they will have all got some sort of qualification. That's a lot, not necessarily very high, but there's something. They will have studied. So I think that makes a difference. And I think Chablis does keep up with what's going on in the rest of the world from the point of view of winemaking techniques and vineyard techniques.
And in vineyard-wise, I mean, is there any one clone of Chardonnay planted? Because obviously all the planting is Chardonnay. But do you?
I think there's several clones. I'm not very well informed on clones, but I think
they're different.
I mean, there are people who will use Massal selection and take clones from their own vineyards.
Okay.
And there is a plot of ungrafted Chardonnay in Chablis.
Oh, that's a.
And suddenly it came as Louis Poitou. He was offered a plot from an elderly guy whose neighbours said, "Oh, he doesn't know how to look after his vines because he just chopped them down." But he realised that there's no graft; they're on their original roots.
Oh wow, they survived
phylloxera. Some of the soil, there is a bit of sand, so it's quite.
Wow.
And he said, at a certain stage, I mean, people automatically planted using grafted vines because that's what you did because that was the insurance. But this, it was an old vineyard, so he just left, which is quite fun. And now he now vinifies it as a separate wine.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. I mean, I didn't even know there was sand in Chablis. I mean, one thing I enjoyed about your book, it was like how personal it felt, because I knew it was like the stories. I loved it.
Yeah, well, I think that's what's fun about writing about wine. It's the people you meet, and I suppose there are people that I have known for quite a long time, should we say. And families I followed. I was bumping into Benoit Drouin pushing a pushchair, and he said, "May I introduce you to the 16th generation?" And I realised that I had actually met his grandfather and his father, so I was meeting his son. So I met 4 of the 16.
Oh wow, that's incredible. And you also wrote in in your book there's all the profiles of the producers and the different. A lot of more information we cannot cover in an half an hour chat. But you also spoke. You also wrote about the Auxerre area. How that sort of in line? How that is moving and what's happening?
I think that's becoming more interesting because that's a positive thing with climate change. That the Pinot Noir in the 1970s, some of it was a bit thin and lean, and now, also with better winemaking, there's some lovely Pinot Noirs. To me, they're very fragrant. They've got a lot of they've got acidity as well as a streak of tannin. They're not heavy wines. There's something very refreshing about them, and I think they've got a future.
So the most of the plantings there is what sort of planting do they have? And there is a Pinot.
Well, there's the reds are Pinot Noir. There was a bit of Gamay, but insignificant. And then you've got, of course, the village of Saint-Brie is known for its Sauvignon. And don't forget, I mean, Sancerre is 50 miles away, so that's what it may have come. And then you've got also there's some white, Bourgogne Blanc, Chardonnay, those vineyards depend on the Yonne, so they've got a different aspect to the vineyards of Chablis, which depend very much on the small river of the Serein. And then, of course, the Auxerrois, there's an important producer of sparkling wine. The Cave de Bailly is it's a sort of cooperative that was set up when there was sort of economic crisis in the sort of I think it goes back to the 70s, or maybe earlier. But so there's quite a significant sparkling wine producer who works with the Côte in Chablis.
Okay, and I mean cooperatives in Chablis, they're still quite.
The Côte in Chablis is it works well for its appellation. It's good, and it's responsible for probably now it's about a quarter of the production of Chablis. I think it has been losing some members because I think there are people in the new generations who want to put their name on a bottle. I mean, so I think that's one of the things that's happening to cooperatives, throughout France.
Yeah, but I mean the thing, as you said, they work well for the appellation. They do. They are quality driven compared to a lot of like.
Yes, they kept ahead. And I think they sell the wines. It's
fantastic. I mean, Rosemary, I think we could just continue speaking about Chablis all afternoon and with the rest of the conversation here. But I think it's super interesting, and I love the wine. I really like the wine Chablis, and I wish I need to explore them more. And
yes, well, you must go and visit. Have you? I mean, have you visited many producers in Chablis?
No, I've never been to Chablis, so I ought to.
Well, I've been to Chablis.
Yeah.
Let's go.
I ought to go to.
Yes,
yeah, sounds great.
Listen, it's a nice little town, and the countryside is not dramatic. We're not talking sort of like the Rhone Valley or somewhere. It's just gentle, undulating vineyards, and Chablis has now got one or two restaurants that are really rather good. So it's you can eat well there.
They open up to tourism as well, I think, or they're getting a bit more.
Yes, because France is not very advanced on wine tourism, but there's a little bit. There are a lot of wine shops in Chablis now, which that's another thing that's changed is the number of wine growers who have a small shop in Chablis.
Okay, so also do they do vineyard cellar visit?
And there are people, yes. I mean, if you went to the tourist office. There are people. I remember one visit to Chablis. The BIVB organised for me to be somebody to show me around the vineyards. So the people are
amazing. That's fantastic. Okay. Rosemary, thank you so much for this half an hour now together, and thank you for your
nice to meet you on the sort of on screen.
Yeah, and once again, I mean, your book is the Wines of Chablis and Auxerre, and I think you also write for. You also have a blog on southern France.
Yes, I write. My blog concentrates on the Languedoc because we have a holiday house in the Languedoc. So I've also written quite extensively about the Languedoc. So my last book, my 14th book, was actually Roussillon rather than Languedoc.
Yeah.
And the Chablis came. The third edition of Chablis came in between Languedoc and Roussillon.
Okay, amazing. Well, Roussillon is also a very interesting topic. I might keep it there on my list to explore at some point.
Okay, I'm very happy. I'd be very happy to talk about the Languedoc, and I'd be very happy to talk about Roussillon
fantastic.
as well. So.
Okay, Rosemary, thank you so much for this afternoon. Very enjoyable.
Right. Well, I've enjoyed myself too. So I love talking about Chablis. So thank you, Mattia. Yes, alla prossima.
You listen to the Looking Into Wine podcast with Rosemary George, Master of Wine, author of the book The Wines of Chablis. If you enjoyed the podcast, remember to hit the subscribe button to know when the next episode are going to be released. I'd just like to give a shout out to my fellow podcaster Chuck Kramer and his podcast Mr. California Wine. If you want to learn about California wine and you want to hear about the speciality of the region, you be sure to go and check out his podcast. If you can find Looking Into Wine on iTunes, Spotify, listening, Amazon Music, and every major listening app. If you enjoy the podcast, you can donate on mattiascapazza.com Music produced by Samuele Donardo. Editing and mastering by Tommaso Ascoli.